Thanks very much, Ken. So I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to introduce my colleague and friend Jacqueline Warwick, Associate Professor of Music and Women's Studies at Dalhousie University and President of IASPM Canada. And I'm so pleased that she agreed to give a keynote address at this conference. Thank you, Jacqueline. Jacqueline left Canada. Every time I've read this sentence, it just sounds weird. Jacqueline left Canada in the late 1990s to pursue her PhD at UCLA, which was a hotbed of what was then called the new musicology, a new approach to musical scholarship that examined the sonic details of music in relationship to the social. It was a moment when the long-held belief that musical sound somehow transcended culture was seriously challenged by scholars such as Susan McClary and Robert Walser, scholars who became Jacqueline's mentors at UCLA. What was really important about that moment, too, was that musicology finally embraced the study of popular music. Finally. And Jacqueline's dissertation on girl groups and girl cultures, subsequently published as a monograph by Routledge, was one of the foundational book-length studies on popular music that took up the details of musical sound, one of the documents that laid the groundwork for others to engage in nuanced musical discourse analysis, a kind of analysis that linked sound with the sociocultural issues of a particular historical moment. I cannot tell you how often I've come back to this book to help inform my own work, or how many times I've assigned it to graduate students who have always been simply blown away by it. The other important thing about this book is that while folks like me were writing about repertories of music that fell under the sign of authentic and worthy of study, Jacqueline paved the way for writing seriously about music that was considered, erroneously, kind of fluffy. Girl group music, really? The stuff that second-wave feminists dismissed as hopelessly regressive in terms of gender politics. Jacqueline found in this music a means through which young women created community, built or solidified friendships, a way of getting through the awkward teenage years and beyond. Not only that, but one of the significant arguments in her book is that the young, mostly black women who sang girl group music in the early 1960s had considerable agency in shaping the sound of that music. She blew apart the idea that they were simply Phil Spector's puppets. Jacqueline has expanded on this work. For example, she interviewed some of the remaining Blossoms a few years ago and produced an important essay detailing how these singers self-consciously developed techniques for singing white or singing black, whatever the session called for. But she has also considered issues of vocality in other repertories, contemporary male voices in pop music, for example, and especially linked these to issues of class, taking up, for example, Nickelback's working class anti-hero Chad Kroeger on the one hand, and emo darling Sufjan Stevens on the other. A few years ago, she was appointed, and she's pretty early in her career. A few years ago, she was appointed as one of the senior editors for the revised edition of the American Grove Dictionary of Music, still in progress. And her new research project takes up the subject of child stars. Although she's at the beginning of this project, she's already published a substantial article on Michael Jackson. That is amazing. So the title of Jacqueline's talk today is Child's Play, Musical Prodigies, and Child Labor. Jacqueline.
Thank you, Susan. That was awesome. Obviously, it's all downhill from here. I do think it's such a pleasure always to come to IASPM Canada. That's been such a hugely supportive and wonderful institution for me through my career. And to be, now your elected president, and to come to a conference organized by my dear friend and mentor, Susan, who's been, equally a wonderful supportive figure for me. And I think in keeping with the conference theme, I think it is important to share with you that my very first sort of musicology experience was here in Hamilton. The year after I finished my undergraduate degree at U of T, I, through a friend of my mother's, so yay, nepotism, I was hired to teach a few courses at Mohawk College School of Music here in Hamilton because someone was on sabbatical. So I was teaching the sort of survey of music history to all these students in the music program. The lecture hall was like a pit with me at the bottom and sort of raked seating all the way up. Most of the students were my age, some of them a little older, and it was so nerve-wracking that I used to vomit every day before class. So I hardly ever do that anymore. So okay, let me get myself set up. All right, we're all set. Okay. So why do we like so much to see children performing? This question has preoccupied me for the last year or so, but the phenomenon of the miraculous wonder child is ancient. Arguably, Jesus was the world's first documented child star. He drew crowds as an infant and then impressed his elders in the temple with wisdom beyond his 12 years. Histories of performance abound with accounts of little ones delighting their audiences, with their lisping speech and dimpled flesh juxtaposed charmingly with precocious skill. The performing child can be understood as a redemptive figure, the magical child who gives us wonder, love, and joy by reawakening our childlike wonder and delight in the world. Often, these magical star children are even seen as sacrificial figures who have been ruthlessly denied normal childhoods, whatever that might mean, in the service of performing versions of childhood that then serve as cultural ideals and exemplars. Sentimentality and nostalgia are thus crucial to our appreciation of performing children, as Carolyn Steedman suggests in her remarkable study of child acrobats in the long 19th century. Steedman argues that the image of the child became central to emerging notions of interiority and the inner self at that time, and it is surely no coincidence that the mythology of the redemptive child arose alongside the increasingly brutal commodification of children in the workplace. Even now, the sight of a child at play, unself-conscious and utterly self-absorbed, is powerfully appealing. And when that scene has been deliberately planned and commodified as a performance, Steedman concludes that the child's manifestation of spontaneity and enjoyment is part of what is purchased with the ticket. So the role of nostalgia in these representations is particularly crucial. I hope to show that the child musicians are overwhelmingly associated with old or old-fashioned repertoire and technique, just as many of the roles available to child actors are characters from literature who are already familiar and beloved. So here are a few examples. So Shirley Temple, the most famous child star of all, probably, played Heidi from the Joanna Spyri, Swiss classics. She also, of course, played the Little Princess, the Frances Hodgson Burnett books. I hope I don't need to tell you who that is. Judy Garland as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. This is Mark Lester in the role of Oliver in the 1967 film, based on Charles Dickens' famous novel. It had been made into a film in the 1920s with Jackie Coogan, but that film has been lost. And then the stage production of Oliver actually gave, in the role of Artful Dodger, who you can see down in the corner there, Steve Marriott of The Small Faces played the Artful Dodger on the London stage, as did Phil Collins. So this show has been kind of a crucible for a lot of emerging artists. Tatum O'Neal in the Paper Moon, a role for which she won an Oscar based on a very successful novel. And Megan Follows as Anne of Green Gables. And of course, Daniel Radcliffe, who played the young David Copperfield before he was cast as Harry Potter. So all of these child performers playing familiar characters from sort of childhood classics. So this reinforces the value of the childhood culture of parents fondly recalling their favorite books and characters and suggesting that these texts are timeless classics that will continue to be cherished by ensuing generations. The child star is thus simultaneously a sentimental reminder of the past and, by virtue of being a child, a symbol of immanence and the future, in keeping with Svetlana Boym's notion that nostalgia is not always about the past, it can be retrospective and prospective. So looking through this lens, we see child performers playing a conservative role, allowing us to adore emblematic children while we exploit real ones, reproducing old-fashioned childhood values and experiences, and reassuring adult audiences of their continued cultural dominance. Joseph Zornato asserts that, I quote, adults invent history not so much from what really happened to them as children, as from what they wished would have happened, suggesting another agenda for rose-tinted depictions of old-fashioned childhood. So this is one explanation for why we like to see children perform, but the question that follows is trickier. Venerated children's author Robert Louis Stevenson asserts that making believe, making things up, is the gist of the child's whole life, and it is undeniable that many children throw themselves into play acting with great abandon. Children's unself-conscious commitment to fantasy worlds of their own creation is among the most alluring aspects of childhood, and this sense of the world as a magical place was powerfully attractive to people like Stevenson's rough contemporaries J.M. Barrie, the creator of Peter Pan, and Charles Dodgson, better known as Alice in Wonderland's author Lewis Carroll. Each of these writers longed to capture the child's wide-eyed wonder in his own writing for children, and each fostered passionate friendships with real children that discomfited his peers almost as much as they trouble modern readers who are more alert to the horrors of pedophilia. But, lest we be too quick to condemn all child performance as nothing more than fodder for creepy old men, theater historian Mara Gubar reminds us that this response oversimplifies the various motivations that seem to attract grown-ups to view child performance, including an appreciation for the skills, not just the bodies, of child actors. And she points out, too, that children themselves are capable of crushes, of scopophilia, and desirous looking. So child performers then seek the approval and admiration of their peers as well as their elders. And precocious children may explore fantasies of fame through playing at performance. As a little boy, Sam Cooke ostensibly used to plant popsicle sticks in the backyard to be his audience when the neighborhood children grew weary of watching him act out his future career as a singer. So play acting, mimicry, dressing up, and telling stories are considered central features of the experience of childhood, and they are often rehearsals for adulthood and sort of experimentation with different identities. The playing of games based on familiar stories, such as playing at Harry Potter, for example, affords children opportunities to identify with particular characters and helps them to construct their own selves. This kind of play acting is imitative and derivative, but it undoubtedly inspires creativity and developmental growth. Almost all children participate in it, and their play is in some ways not very different from the performances of children in formal productions, begging my next question: to what extent can we recognize a child's performance as work? In her searing history of child labor in the United States, Viviana Zelizer studies the disputes that responded to efforts to limit the use of children in the workforce in the early 20th century. And I note that in the very next room, actually, there's a fantastic display with some information about child labor here in Southern Ontario. Zelizer notes that during the 19th century, children were actually more likely to do paid work than were married women, and some jobs were available only to children. Children's tiny, nimble fingers were particularly prized in picking cotton, spinning, and sewing, for example, and of course this continues to be true in the garment industry. A 1924 US amendment to the Constitution set limits on child labor, leading to vociferous public debate. Supporters of unregulated child labor, which included Harold Gray, the creator of the Little Orphan Annie cartoon, argued that works keep children out of mischief, that children of the lower classes naturally yearn to bring something home to mother, and that the discipline learned on the factory floor trained children in the Protestant work ethic and the American dream. It was asserted, too, that children denied opportunity in legitimate industries would be forced to earn their living in illegal, unprotected work, an argument that has been made again more recently in Nicholas Kristof's investigation of children in the sex trade. Another objection to regulating child labor in the 1920s was that this legislation disrupted the hierarchy of the family by limiting a parent's right to send children out into the workforce. This is ironic when we consider that many child stars, such as Shirley Temple, became the primary breadwinners for their families and thus threatened family hierarchy by out-earning their fathers. This kind of conflict, some of you may remember, assumed tragic proportions in the case of 10-year-old actress Judith Barcy, who was killed by her abusive father in 1988, in part because he was tormented by how she had displaced him as head of the household. So perhaps for this reason alone, it has been important for many showbiz families to deny that their children's careers involve actual work. Shirley Temple's mother, for example, insisted that Shirley's time on the film set was just for fun, and that her husband's job as bank manager was what funded their middle-class lifestyle. That fiction did eventually become untenable, at which point the Temple father began a new career, joining his wife as co-manager of their daughter. Children who worked as performers in the 19th century and early 20th century certainly fared better than their counterparts in the mines, mills, or chimneys, if only because children on the stage had to appear healthy and well cared for in order to be attractive. So unlike Addie Card, pictured here, Shirley Temple retreated to a comfortable home with plenty to eat at the end of her workday. But her earliest film work, begun when she was 4 in a series called Baby Burlesques, was grueling. The all-child casts worked long, often unpaid hours, with their parents banned from the film set. The director bullied and terrorized his tiny actors, who, as you can see, are really quite tiny. They're toddlers for the most part. He would lock them into equipment cases when they misbehaved and often forced them to work even when they were ill or injured. The baby burlesque films themselves are breathtakingly exploitative in sexual and racist ways. You can find these if you want to see them. But Temple has always been ambivalent about the extent to which she suffered making these films. Certainly, this trial by fire ensured that Shirley was a disciplined professional by the time she signed with 20th Century Fox at the age of 6. Here, her work conditions improved enormously, partly because she became a valuable commodity for the studio, and partly because of new labor standards being negotiated and introduced. So the Screen Actors Guild formed in 1933, and in 1938, the US Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act to regulate work conditions and prohibit child labor in many industries. An exemption to the prohibition on child labor was inspired by Temple's own success in the film industry for, and I'm quoting now from the legislation, any child employed as an actor or performer in motion pictures or theatrical productions or in radio or television productions. And this was known as the Shirley Temple Act. The following year, 1939, saw a more committed effort to protect child actors with the enactment of Coogan's Law. Jackie Coogan, known at the height of his fame as the world's boy king, had been the first important child star in the Hollywood system in the 1920s. From his poignant debut alongside Charlie Chaplin, pictured here, the kid, Coogan played a series of waifs and orphans through the 1920s, a time when many families were struggling to raise children whose fathers had died in the trenches, and at the very moment that Hollywood was establishing itself as the entertainment capital of the world. Yet when Coogan reached the age of majority in 1935, he discovered that his parents had spent all his earnings. Upon taking them to court, he found that nothing prevented them from having done so, as a child's earnings belonged, by law, to his parents. The trial was a sensation, with public support for Coogan the more heartfelt in the face of his legal defeat. And his mother, who herself was a former child performer in vaudeville, defended her actions by insisting that Jackie's acting had all been a delightful game for him. So in recognition of this legal injustice, the California Civil Code was amended in an effort to protect other performing children from their parents, giving the court the power to require that, in return for the child giving up all rights to disaffirm a contract in the future, a trust fund would be established to hold up to 50% of the child's net earnings. Coogan's Law has been updated many times, and it currently holds that a minor's earnings for artistic or creative services are the sole property of that minor. So that's a big improvement. However, it's unclear, there's still a lot of negotiation about this law. It's unclear whether that would extend to children appearing in reality shows, for example. Is their work artistic and creative service, or is it just a documentary? This is also why a lot of current child stars, their parents are also their managers, because then they can pay themselves a salary out of the child's gross earnings and not be bound by the net earnings law. So, the careers of Coogan and Temple are instructive not only because they inspired changes in legislation around child labor in the entertainment industry, but also because of the striking similarities in the roles they played and their consequent importance to child acting. Each child had a quality of being bigger than big and smaller than small, that is, physically diminutive and babyish, but simultaneously mature and self-possessed. Coogan, Temple, and many other child actors tended to be cast in stories where their characters were thrown into peril, arousing the audience's concern, obliged to be plucky and resilient, charming the audience with their quasi-adult behavior, until they were rescued, usually by a kindly older man, who stood in for the audience in learning the true meaning of goodness from the wise child. Now, the sight of Temple attempting a sassy swagger with her short, chubby legs is often delightfully awkward and clumsy, an adorable incompetence with adult gesture that we could compare to the cuteness of a toddler trying to walk in mummy's shoes, or a small boy attempting gravitas in a jacket and tie. And here, the difference between play and performance becomes blurred. We see children in everyday life mimicking adult stances in ways that force us to see them looking over the brink of childhood and trying on adult identities, all too impatient to shed their carefree childish ways. The successful child actor is one who can perform this function reliably and professionally while maintaining the appearance of spontaneity and innocence and not looking too knowing. The charm of the child star is artless as well as ephemeral. So it is a truism that child stars of acting do not continue into adult careers as actors, and certainly Temple famously did not. Coogan, a lot of people don't know, he retreated from acting as a young man but had a comeback. Does anybody know what his big role as an adult was? He was Uncle Fester in the Addams Family. That beautiful little boy became, yeah, anyway. So, do you need a minute? So there are exceptions to this rule, but it is a fact that the charm of child actors is often fleeting. The older Gary Coleman got on different strokes, the less adorable was his catchphrase. So here I make an important distinction between child stars, whose evanescent gifts are charm and charisma, and child prodigies, whose durable gifts are skill and discipline. In her valuable work on gifted children, psychologist Ellen Winner differentiates child actors who are good at mimicry and role play from child prodigies whose rage to master their chosen domain of creativity compels them to learn rapidly and to develop technical expertise at an unusually early age. So here's a few examples of child prodigies, and I'm distinguishing them from child stars. So, of course, the young Mozart is always the kind of textbook example of the child prodigy. Teresa Milanolo, an early 19th century Spanish violin virtuoso, for whom there's a theater in Spain named for her. The young Clara Wieck, later Clara Schumann, was a concertizing child prodigy through her childhood. Yehudi Menuhin, the young violinist. Peter Schreier, who became a highly respected interpreter of art song and began his singing career as a little boy. Glenn Gould, seen here with his teacher at the Conservatory in Toronto. Stevie Wonder, of course, who was little Stevie Wonder in the early part of his career, and Jan Lisiecki, who's currently, I believe he's 18 now, so I guess it's maybe a little premature for me to say he's going to have an adult career, but certainly he's had a very successful career as a child prodigy until now. Okay. The widely accepted definition of a prodigy is a child under the age of 10 who is able to perform at or beyond the standard of an adult professional in a cognitively demanding domain, defying the 10,000-hour rule that's been identified by Malcolm Gladwell and others. The 10,000-hour rule is the idea that it takes that many hours of effort and practice in order to get good at something, and obviously a child who can master those things, by the age of 8 has not, in fact, put in 10,000 hours, so they've sort of shortcut that effort. Prodigies are commonly identified in fields such as math, science, chess, language, the visual arts, and of course, music. Child prodigies are most commonly male, usually firstborn or only children with at least one parent who is competent to nurture their abilities. Often, they have suffered lengthy illness that enforced some kind of solitary, tranquil activity for an extended period of time. Interestingly enough, musical giftedness tends to reveal itself earlier than other prodigious talents. So while a math prodigy emerges at around age 4, musical prodigies may sing accurately before they can walk or talk. Developmental psychologists identify 3 signifiers of giftedness: the precocious rapid mastery of skill, the rage to master or an obsessive interest and motivation, and an idiosyncratic learning style that involves learning on one's own with minimal adult intervention. So I dare say many of the parents in the room are sort of thinking of their own children. This is where it all falls apart for me. My kids hate to practice and cannot be made to do it. So a true prodigy is the one who will go for hours and do that on his or her own. Okay, I'll show you a clip of this. This little boy, Frank Robinson, grew up in Detroit and was a prodigy of boogie-woogie piano from a very young age. He performed at the White House, and apparently in the middle of his performance he called out, "How am I doing, Mr. President?" And this became his sort of catchphrase. And then he had a sort of cameo appearance in this otherwise forgettable Hollywood movie, which is great for me because it's a really high-quality film of him playing. So while we're looking at this, look at his hands. Watch his hands while he's playing. is a child prodigy a child laborer? When a defining characteristic of prodigies is intense motivation to learn independently and master new skills for the sheer joy of it, it seems reasonable to say no. But while this may be a satisfactory conclusion for, say, the child prodigy of chess, the distinction between work and play is murkier in the case of a musical prodigy, who is a performer as well as a technical whiz. The boy Mozart, always the paradigmatic example, even in scholarship from the field of developmental psychology, was after all renowned for his adorable looks and charisma as much for his artistry at the keyboard, and this dual appeal is obviously crucial as well for a child like Frankie Robinson. Robinson's skill is the result of a tremendous investment of effort at the keyboard, yet it's clear from his technique that no teacher drilled him in scales, no tiger mother was nagging him and punishing him for mistakes. So the film clip of, unless his teacher was Charles Ives, I guess that's a possibility, but this film clip of Robinson beautifully shows the child instrumentalist's idiosyncratic, self-taught playing style, but it's of course more difficult to see this in the case of a singing prodigy, and I am, after all, primarily interested in singing. So nevertheless, my case study is a child star whose singing catapulted him and his family to international fame through the 1970s. René Simard. Simard's story involves virtually every cliché of child stars and prodigies, making him invaluable to my thinking in this project. This album cover from 1972 encapsulates many of the complex and contradictory aspects of child musicianship. He's depicted with backlighting to make him appear more ethereal and angelic. He's handling the microphone like a pro, neatly belying the disingenuous claim that he is an enfant comme les autres, a child like any other. Okay, so Simard is the fifth of 7 children, born and raised in a poor working-class Québécois family. At the time of his birth, his father Jean-Roch worked as a cook in a logging camp near Chicoutimi, but he drank and he had difficulty holding down a job, so the family moved around a great deal. When René was 6, he became dangerously ill with hepatitis, enforcing a long hospital stay, and the following year, the family settled on the Île d'Orléans near Quebec City. At that time, it was a rustic, ungentrified community. I think it's not like that anymore. Jean-Roch became music director at their village church. Now, this does not mean he's conducting a choir in Palestrina motets. It means he's playing acoustic guitar and leading the congregation in sort of simple call and response singing, often with his own children assisting. When René was 9, he and his next eldest brother, Régis, went alone into Quebec City to audition for a TV talent show hosted by local impresario Jean Roger. The boys would later claim to have been motivated by a desire to earn money so they could buy their long-suffering mother a house. I'm not sure to what extent that's actually true. It's the kind of mythologizing that often attaches itself to these kinds of stories. Of course, it bears comparison with the story about Elvis Presley making that record for his mother's birthday, which doesn't actually hold up under scrutiny. Nevertheless, René won the competition with his rendition of Schubert's Ave Maria. Now, I presume he had learned this piece by ear for church performance. It was certainly prominent in church repertoire and sung by performers who would not have attempted other Schubert lieder. I know that René was not musically literate, and I assume his father also played and taught by ear, but I don't have the facts on that right just yet. René's success led to a career through the 70s and 80s with tours to Europe and Japan. He performed at the 1976 Montreal Olympics. He did a show in Las Vegas with Liberace. He appeared on other US television shows hosted by figures such as Bob Hope and Merv Griffin. And in the late 70s, he had his own English language variety show on CBC in his late teens hosted by Alan Thicke. So as this resume might suggest, his sound and style were conservative, with an old-fashioned pop sort of showbiz singing style and material, particularly of hits made popular by other child stars such as Donny Osmond or Michael Jackson during the 60s and 70s. So he would sing French cover versions of Jackson 5 songs, is what I'm suggesting. The phenomenon of singing French cover versions of English language hits through the 60s and 70s was very common in Quebec, and of course in other parts of the non-Anglophone world, and many stars participated in it, alongside chansonniers like Gilles Vigneault, who were writing original poetic and patriotic songs, so this is all sort of happening at the same time. René did not hit puberty and the change of voice until the age of 15, so that enabled an unusually long career as a boy singer, commodified in all the ways we have seen associated with other child actors. Now, in my research, I have found that child singers, and actually we could extend this to instrumentalists also, fall broadly into 2 categories. There's the child with the voice of an angel, who is fragile and ethereal, and then there's the little child with the great big voice, who is sassy, earthy, and comic. As the images I've chosen suggest, these archetypes are often freighted with class, race, and gender associations. Of course, the angel type is not exclusive to girls, doesn't always work that way. Judy Garland would be a good example of the little girl with the great big voice. I am increasingly fascinated with the ways that singing style and vocal technique communicate information about class background and all those things. And at the same time, with the fluidity of these categories. So Charlotte Church, for example, was considered an angelic singer at the start of her career. She was described as a little opera singer in the early part of her career, but was quickly recast as tawdry and low class when she hit adolescence and developed a woman's body. And suddenly it was remembered that her family was not as posh as we had thought. So I'll ask you to bear these ideas in mind as we consider René Simard's signature hit, L'Oiseau. Now, a little background on the song. René was not the first child to perform this song, and he probably learned it from watching the French television program Belle et Sébastien, which was a series of a lonely orphan boy who befriends a wild dog in the Pyrenees Mountains between the border of France and Spain. The show ran in France through the late 60s and dubbed into English in Britain, on and off through the 60s and 70s, where, among other things, it obviously played a formative role in the childhoods of future mopey indie rock stars. The end credits song, L'Oiseau, was recorded by the star Mehdi El-Glaoui, this adorable little boy, who was himself a child performer of great interest. He is the biracial son of former film star Cécile Aubry, who, as you can see, actually wrote the series. She'd had a minor Hollywood career. She started in a movie with Orson Welles, so that's a pretty big deal, but only did one Hollywood film. And then she retreated to France and wrote these television programs starring her son. El-Glaoui's father was the son of a privileged and powerful Moroccan family. Like René Simard, Mehdi El-Glaoui grew up in the country, but in his case it was because his Hollywood star mother raised him in a former chateau when she retreated from the public eye, seeking a quiet life away from tabloid gossip. I'll play you a little bit of the song in Mehdi's performance. I haven't given you a translation of the lyrics, largely because they are sort of poetic and allegorical. The song is melancholy and wistful. It's actually a beautiful piece. It's a minor key setting of lyrics. It's about a bird that has been chased away by the wind, and it's addressed to the white hare who longs for the bird's return. A hare like the big rabbit, I mean, not this kind of hare. So yeah, it's a sort of a metaphorical, poetic song. So we'll hear a little bit of Mehdi El-Glaoui's performance. So, while El-Glaoui's bell-like tone, crisp diction, and controlled breathing suggest he must have had some vocal instruction, René Simard's version takes a different character. I'll ask you to pay attention to the changes in orchestration, certainly, and in singing style as we hear René Simard perform it.
La chanson qui le propulse au sommet de la gloire, L'Oiseau.
ear, Simard fits neatly into the little boy with the great big voice model, in contrast to El Glaoui's more frail, angelic performance. The kind of Vega style accompaniment, Simard's theatrical gestures, he does, je l'ai entendu pleurer, I heard the bird crying, sort of a bit hammy. And above all, his full, powerful voice suggests a robust, cheerful child. And that little balloon image that you all giggled at, of him smiling, I think is meant to reinforce his ordinariness, that he's a happy little boy, even though he's singing this sad song, which in turn accentuates his extraordinary talent by depicting him as an ordinary boy. His vocal performance is close to a music theater belting style with kind of lowered larynx and resonance mainly in the chest voice, imitative of adult singers of the day such as Tom Jones. He has an instinctive grasp of style and emotional message, and that's evident, I think. But his vibrato is forced and a bit strident sometimes, indicating an untutored vocal technique. And also there are a few instances where we see him struggling to swallow, which I think is also suggestive that he hasn't really been coached. I suggest that these stylistic features, together with his Québécois diction, combine to present René clearly as a working-class child of the people, in contrast to El Glaoui's sort of introspective, fragile performance that coincides with more middle-class tastes. Certainly, René's talent was quickly commodified, as he and his whole family were pushed into the spotlight in a quasi-documentary film in 1972, innumerable tabloid stories and advertisements. Now, in his extensive work on children and consumer culture, Gary Cross notes that the iconic pure child of the 19th century was redefined as cute in the 20th century, and that consumption played an important role in this transformation. Parents were increasingly encouraged to awaken a child's delight and wonder through buying him treats and toys. Child performers modeled this experience in commercials like this one, where the prospect of chocolate pudding causes the Simard children to burst into joyful song. Now, I warn you, this is one of those tunes that will be stuck in your head forever. I played it once for my daughter, and she was like, "Mommy, why did you do that?"
Régis, quoi? C'est une petite chanson? Laquelle? La chanson des petits puddings. Oh oui! Qu'est-ce qui fait donc chanter la petite Simard? C'est le petit pudding, Laura ce corps. Qu'est-ce qui nous fait crier, j'en veux encore? C'est le petit pudding, Laura. On tire la bobinette, pas besoin d'assiette, et c'est l'affaire de quelques secondes. On se casse pas la tête, la recette est faite, ça se mange partout, par tout le monde. Qu'est-ce qui fait donc chanter les petits Simards, les petits puddings, leur recevoir? Qu'est-ce qui les fait crier, j'en veux encore? C'est les petits puddings, leur recevoir.
Les petits puddings Nora Secor sont vendus en 4 saveurs chez votre épicier.
Okay. They don't make those puddings anymore. They were delicious, though. I loved them. Anyway, I'm sure there was something horrible in them. Anyway. So the sing-along style of the commercial is clearly meant to help audiences identify with the children, of course with the bouncing dot to help us sing along, reinforcing the kind of down-home, one-of-us aura that surrounded the Simard family. And René's stagey, knowing wink at the end fits the aesthetics of contemporary variety shows featuring the Jacksons and the Osmonds, and of course René's own show towards the end of the decade. Many of the Simard children attempted careers in music and entertainment, but the only other notable success was the youngest, Nathalie. As you can see, the Simard family was very committed to that hairstyle. We've seen Nathalie just now in that commercial. She was the little girl. She would have been about 2.5 or 3 at the time of that commercial, and I've watched it a lot of times. When she's clapping along, she shows a very strong sense of rhythm, whereas the other boy, I think it's Martin with the purple sweater, at one point he's keeping time. And so, okay, so I'll play so Nathalie launched a career in 1980, and I've chosen a song of hers to play for you, which is typical of repertoire for child singers, Voulez-vous danser, grand-mère? It's a sentimental song of a 60th wedding anniversary party where a little girl urges grandma and grandpa to dance as they used to in the bon vieux temps. We'll hear it starting just before the chorus, where it shifts from minor to major as the strings swell, the melody moves to a higher, brighter part of Nathalie's range.
Champagne qui pétille, fait pétiller tous les yeux, quand une petite fille dit en riant au bon vieux: voulez-vous danser, grand-mère? Voulez-vous valser, grand-père? Tout comme au bon
The song is a bit heavy-handed, I acknowledge. Certainly Nathalie as a singer is not in the same league as her older brother. Her voice is pleasant and she sings in tune, but she doesn't have his grasp of phrasing nor his instinct for language and storytelling, I think. Even so, she was a major figure in Quebec pop culture through the 80s. She starred in 2 television shows, released several albums, and modeled a children's clothing line that was named for her. But behind the girl's pretty smiles was a dark, sordid story of abuse and exploitation that is sadly inescapable in my investigation of child performers. The Simard parents had divorced in 1975, leaving 6-year-old Nathalie alone at home with her angry, lonely mother as her older siblings drifted by fits and starts into adulthood. She was much younger than the rest of them. When she was 10, Guy Cloutier, who had managed Renée's career since he was 11, signed Nathalie and began to build her career, taking her on the road for extended performance tours with and without her brother. Although he unquestionably succeeded in making her famous, Guy Cloutier was convicted in 2004 of sexually abusing Nathalie over at least a year, beginning when she was 11, along with another child whose name has not been released. Now, in the Quebec music industry, Cloutier was himself a minor celebrity at the time that he signed her, largely because of his success with the Simard children. And this is kind of eerie. He worked closely with his friend René Angelil, who produced some of René Simard's earliest recordings. So who we have here is Nathalie up in the top corner, then Nathalie and René signing with Guy Cloutier. Guy Cloutier worked closely with René Angelil. They were good friends, and Angelil produced some of the Simard children's recordings. And then, of course, when a girl singing prodigy, another 11-year-old, you see she's very close in age to Nathalie, the young Céline Dion, was looking for a manager in the early 80s. The 2 top choices were Cloutier and Angelil, and she signed with Angelil famously and later married him. So each of these men ended up managing a prepubescent girl singer and had uncomfortable relationships with her. Okay, so Cloutier's crimes against Nathalie fit the profile of the practiced pedophile who tends to choose a vulnerable, unhappy child and groom her carefully. The young girl may have felt abandoned at home by her father and siblings and eager to get away from her bitter, brooding mother to take her chance at stardom with a man who was, after all, a trusted family friend. As for why the abuse remained secret for so long, Nathalie may have been understandably afraid to ask for help from parents who were preoccupied with their toxic relationship and their other children, or from her older brother, even, who she may even have seen as colluding with Cloutier. And there's some suggestion that she has said he helped Cloutier gain access to her, and then she's retracted those statements. I think it's perfectly understandable, but she would be confused on those issues. But the sexual exploitation of child stars does not always confine itself to this kind of outright criminal assault. The phenomenon of a child performer blurs the distinction between adult and child in many ways. The high-earning child as family breadwinner, the child with adult intellect and capacity, and most dangerously, the adorable child who sets out to coax our love in the audience. In his insightful work on the eroticization of children in Victorian literature, James Kincaid suggests that precocious children fascinate in part because of the ways they transgress the boundary between childish innocence and adult sexuality, that's actually what we're fascinated by, and that our collective adoration of child stars often fetishizes and sexualizes their very innocence. I've seen this tons of times in interviews with René Simard at age 10 and 11, where he's asked, oh, do you have a girlfriend? Do you like girls? Have you ever kissed a girl before? These kinds of questions, which really are highly inappropriate to ask of a boy at that age. It is as though his unusual musical talent suggests some other precocious ability, some other hidden way that he can be like an adult while still looking like a child. Alternatively, the spectator may be deriving some titillation from seeing a child ape sexual knowledge while presumably being utterly ignorant of what it means. So I remind you of Frankie Robinson's performance of Caledonia, a very body-suggestive song, appeals at least partly because of his delivery of the line, oh, but Mama didn't know what Caledonia was putting down, which seems to combine innocence with knowingness, winkingly suggesting something that children ought not to know about. This type of performance aligns with the phenomenon of child beauty pageants, in which very small children strut and preen in highly sexualized movements that are ostensibly neutralized by their immaturity and innocence. Because child stars and prodigies are, above all, meant to be looked at. When we merely hear a virtuosic guitar solo or a brilliant piano sonata, the performer's age matters very little to our appreciation of the performance. It's the sight of the child's tiny hands on the guitar strings, the dimpled cheeks scrunched up into guitar face, the short legs swaggering with confidence. That's what makes the sounds remarkable. Unless it is juxtaposed with smaller than small, bigger than big fails to dazzle. So the wondrousness of the child prodigy is inextricably bound up with the notion of spectacle. It's worth noting that a secondary meaning for the word prodigy is a freak event, something outside of nature, even a portent, and certainly a sight to behold. So the Dion quintuplets were adored around the world, 5 identical quintuplets. And it's estimated that through the 1930s, 6,000 visitors a day bought tickets to gaze at the marvel of 5 identical pretty babies in their theme park, Quintland. In other words, they were drawing more people than Niagara Falls was to Ontario at that time. So although they were not workers in the usual sense of the term, the Quints were major contributors to Ontario's economy during the Depression years, just as Shirley Temple was Hollywood's biggest box office draw. The quintuplets' labor looked like spontaneous, carefree play, but it was in service of an industry that engaged millions as customers and as workers, and the Dion family endured many sacrifices in the service of their daughter's career. I know it's difficult now, in an age where the entertainment industry employs so many cute, sassy children, to grasp the magical, almost spiritual power of child stars in the 1920s and 30s. When Jackie Coogan made public appearances in the 20s, people turned up in the hundreds of thousands just to catch a glimpse of he was known as the most beautiful boy in the world, as though his aura alone could convey them some benefit. The philosopher Peter Kivy has argued that the wunderkind Mozart was the very embodiment of romantic ideals of pure genius, which was supposed to spring from nature, romantic with a capital R, I mean, supposed to spring from nature, but was also malleable and infinitely perfectible. The boy Mozart's supernatural talent, he played by ear, his technical achievement, he was famously sensitive to unpleasant sounds, would be reduced to tears if there was a truck backing up or something like that, which set him apart from ordinary mortals. Of course, in a time of high infant mortality, every child was seen as mystical, otherworldly, and not entirely human. Even today, it's common to describe a newborn as a miracle, a mystery, and a symbol of hope. So this, then, is the work that child performers do for us. They show us the beautiful potential and the fragility of the human condition. And because childhood is like performance in being transient and ephemeral, but also powerful, child performers are an important key to understanding the importance of music and art in our lives. Thank you. Thanks very much. Does anybody have any questions for me? I love to talk about child stars, so. Yes?
Would you classify, and this doesn't have a question, but how do you feel about more modern child stars like Justin Bieber or Macaulay Culkin?
Yeah, people always ask me about Bieber. And I think he probably was a child prodigy from what I understand. He was, had that prodigious talent, lots of instruments that he mastered at a very young age. But because his career began sort of when he was in his teens, pre-puberty, right? We heard his voice break between the first record and the second. So he doesn't quite fall into my category. I don't think, I'm really sticking to this idea of the child at age 10 or under. That's the kind of the standard definition of a prodigy in most of the literature in developmental psychology. So Bieber is a little bit too old for me. Macaulay Culkin is not, though, right? That he absolutely is typical of many of these children. Of course, he sued his parents for some kind of financial wrongdoing. So his story is not that different from Temple or Coogan. Yeah. Yes?
I wanted to get your thoughts on what several children may have,
Yeah.
the spectacle. Did you find that as they became adult performers that they continued with that kind of behavior?
Yeah, I have children myself, so a lot of this, and my daughter is very interested in performance and thinks of herself as an actor and singer, so a lot of this is kind of motivated by watching them. I know that in the little boy actors in Shakespeare's day, we know famously that women were not on the Tudor stage, right? So women's roles were played by young boys, and typically those boys were, it was an apprenticeship, right? You played the women's roles until your voice broke, and then you became an adult male actor. So there wasn't this idea of the mystical wonder child. It was just you were learning a trade, like any other kind of apprenticeship. The appeal of hamminess is something I'm quite interested in. I see with my daughter and her friends that the songs they like are all the really melodramatic ones, right? Like with Les Mis, Cosette's song is perfectly age appropriate for my daughter, but no, she wants to sing I Dreamed a Dream, right? And she's, running around the house saying like, so different from this hell I'm living, and that's what she loves. And I see all of her peers are like that too. They like these melodramatic, tragic, it's like they're trying on those emotions before they can experience them. And I assume I'll see them outgrowing that as they become more mature. I think the child performer who doesn't let that go doesn't have an adult career. I think you have to let that go at a certain point and make that transition from the behavior, the gestures and style that sort of charmed people when you were 10. It's not going to work the same way when you're 20. You need to adapt and adopt a different kind of creative style if you're going to have an adult career.
I was thinking, we had Charlotte Church up there. I can't help but think of the phone hacking scandal that's written, and the way in which the tabloids just constantly pursued her. She grew up as now she's a mother herself.
That's right.
They never really let up on her. I don't know if there's something you want to say about that kind of ongoing interest. Is there a sense of almost public ownership of these kids?
Oh, absolutely there is, yeah. And certainly in the case of Charlotte Church, I think, you're absolutely right. The British press never stopped talking about her, right? And she sort of made that transition. And there's a very good book by sociologist Jane O'Connell about child stars, not so much child musicians, but she writes a lot about Charlotte Church. She's a British scholar, so Charlotte Church is one of her case studies. This idea that, they're never really let go. They're never really sort of allowed to drop out of view, in the sense that, we own this child. We loved you as a little girl. How dare you start getting drunk and acting slutty at clubs, right? There is this sense of ownership. Absolutely, I think that's true. And a betrayal too, right? That you weren't supposed to turn out this way, right? Yes, Christina.
Great paper. I'm curious, it seemed you were making a gesture toward the end to times of economic depression or recession, at a point when there's an increasing prominence of child stars, which seems to link into some of the points you were making about shifts in the family structure that are changed by a high-earning child star. So could I ask if you push that further, or would you be willing to push that further in connections between, say, the 30s and, say, 2008?
Sure, yeah. I think Roosevelt, would he have been one of the presidents during the 30s, made this statement about how it is so wonderful that in this time of hardship, anyone can pay a nickel to go and see a laughing, smiling baby, to go and look at a laughing, smiling baby, in reference to Shirley Temple, that she was seen as this great distraction, that we can forget all our troubles and look at this innocent, carefree child. And so there is this implication that it's at times of hardship that we want that most. So yes, possibly we could make a case for that. Like Simard coming up in the 70s, right, at a time of a great political, sort of fraught political and economic times, and is the sort of this symbol of Quebec nationalism in a lot of ways, although he didn't actually sing nationalistic material. I think that's, and in fact a lot of child performers sing sort of sentimental, patriotic songs a lot of the time. That's a big part of the repertoire that they do. Yeah.
Just thinking back on that, watching some of the early Shirley Temple movies where she's throughout war, and she's in with cavalry and she's giving these commands to the captains, right? And so there's this whole moralistic thing that she goes through. So I also wonder if there's certain moral messages that we should be getting during these times to help build us up and tell us how to be.
Yeah, you're thinking of The Littlest Colonel, right? I think, is that the movie you're thinking of? Yeah, but at the end she sits on Abraham Lincoln's lap for this long extended scene. And there is, I think, something about that, the idea of how adorable this little girl leading the army. It's absurd, right? Like obviously she can't have any real power and authority, but so there's this idea of they're indulging her and letting her take this leadership role. But we are also meant to be listening, right? Listen up, stick together. We've got to work as a team. I think that's absolutely true. That this idea that the children are the mouthpiece for often for this sort of conservative dogma a great deal of the time. Yeah, I think that's true. Yes. Oh. I don't know. You guys fight it out. Yeah.
I'm having
Thanks for such a fascinating paper.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, what's your take in regards to Simone Bolivar Orchestra, right, the male, and the kind of widespread belief that these children are actually prodigies.
So like El Sistema and those kinds of programs? Yeah, I am hugely, acutely interested in that program and that kind of method of training prodigies, and the whole sort of philosophy of El Sistema, if you don't know, is a Venezuelan program to give musical training to the poorest of the poor, and some children. Gustavo Dudamel, who is now the conductor of the LA Phil, one of the great big rock star orchestral conductors in the world, came up through that program. And my understanding is he really was sort of from the barrio and came up through El Sistema. There is an El Sistema program in New Brunswick, interestingly enough, and I'm in contact with someone who teaches in it. So I'm hoping to find out more about their philosophy and their sort of what they think they're doing and why these particular instruments and repertoires. I find that quite fascinating, but I don't have any information yet. But yes, I'm certainly fascinated. Do you know anything about El Sistema that you can tell me? Or
I'm from Venezuela. I've been actually following the whole career of different branches in Venezuela, and also happy that I'm now teaching and studying the first branch established in Prague, in Scotland, with I think 5 years. But where, of course, from Venezuelans, talking about Sistema is kind of tricky thing. There are, of course, we're branching the whole initiative as a social revolution initiative, but it didn't start like that.
Okay, I'm going to buy you a drink later because I need to hear more about that. That sounds very interesting. Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
I just want to say that you comment about how your comment, someone commented about how childhood we feel like we own child starts, and then when it starts going up, we reject them from being too slightly. And we think it's slightly things we all have.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. She's a great example of that she's so perky and sassy and cute when she's little, and then when she gets older, we suddenly don't know what to do with her, and there's this idea of,
And she's completely rejected in her adult career.
Absolutely, yeah. Maybe partly because she didn't turn out to be that good of an actor, but that's part of it, right? But
also because I think people like her better as a sweet little child.
Certainly.
They can project whatever onto, as opposed to an actual adult who actually put her just into the mind of their own.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a big part of Jane O'Connor's idea about how we reject child actors as they get older. And I think actually that's this just sort of dawned on me today. I think that's part of the reason why The Simpsons has been so successful, because those little cartoon kids, we never saw them grow up, right? They just stay the same age year after year after year, and so we don't have to go through that with them and watch them become, get pimples and gangly and unattractive. We could just always keep them as little and own them that way. I think that's certainly true. Charity.
Jacqueline, thanks so much. Lots to think about. But one of the things that I keep coming back to is, even with the Mickey Mouse Club, etc., all of these child stars, the way that young women are challenged and actually just taken out and basically beaten down in the media is very different than the way that the young male child stars are looked at.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could just maybe speak to that. Obviously, there are issues and problems with certainly how young men are treated as they grow, but it's different what Bieber does and how he can get away with the same kind of thing that Hillary could not get away with, etc.
Yeah.
And the way that they're positioned. So I was just wondering if you could maybe speak.
Yeah, and I didn't talk about that very much in this paper, but as you know me well, it is something I'm very preoccupied with, is how little girls fare differently from boys, and the way that the little girls are sexualized, that their innocence is sexualized. I mean, some of these Shirley Temple movies are, they are really something, right? Where she's kind of prancing around in a diaper and she's playing a prostitute, right? And yeah, the sort of the fetishization of the little girl's body as she grows, and the kind of the ownership we feel that there was Emma Watson, is that who I mean, from the Harry Potter movies? There was a website that had a countdown by the seconds to her 18th birthday, the moment at which it would be legal to take paparazzi shots like up her skirt and those kinds of things, because up until that point it was illegal. She was protected, and people were watching, waiting for the moment when it would be okay, when it would be legal to objectify her in those humiliating and degrading ways. So I mean, there is we eat them up and spit them out. we do, and particularly with the little girls. Ellen Winner is this child psychologist that I'm reading a lot of her work, and she talks about like child prodigies as, you know, we expect them to go on and have eminent careers, but child stars, we just eat them up. They're like bubblegum. We eat them up and spit them out again. And so that's, and yet, so I feel the music thing does kind of straddle that, and it's very different for girls. Absolutely, I agree with that. So, yeah. Oh, all sorts of stuff is happening now. Yes.
About child labor, do you make a difference between a child who is a child prodigy who learns an instrument by himself and a talentless child who is forced to learn by himself? Do you see that labor?
I mean, I do. You know, on a case-by-case basis, sure. I see a difference in that. The child who, you know, runs home from school and locks himself in the room with the guitar and does this for hours and you know, because of the love of it, and with the child whose mother is saying, like, you know, we have a bar mitzvah this weekend, get up there and practice, right? So absolutely there seems to be a difference. I think that when the performance is commodified, that does blur that distinction for me a little bit. It's very murky for me. I can't tell, right? And if, you know, I mean, with all of us, with any performer, really, right? Like, we love what we do. We love making music. We spend hours practicing it, and we get very little remuneration. You know, and for a lot of musicians, you know, I remember somebody saying to me as an undergrad, like, well, music is great as a part-time gig, right?
Can you make observation about the future with the difference from what on the
Well, I mean, I guess most child prodigies, instrumentalists, a lot of them do seem to go on and have adult careers if they're not, if they're psychologically strong enough for it, right?
Yeah, so Renee is a prodigy, and
yeah.
she was kind of
she was pushed into it, and yes, and obviously that was a damaging experience for her in ways that we assume it was not for her brother. He is still active in showbiz, right? He is still performing and doing stuff, and she has kind of reappeared from time to time. Yeah, no, she hasn't had the kind of adult career that yeah, and I don't think that was ever expected. You know, frankly, it's odd that Celine Dion did, right? That's the unexpected thing, that she actually made that transition. Nobody probably saw that coming. Yeah. Yeah.
So then, what do you feel about happiness? The word I just learned. But Celine played the happiness in her adult years of life.
But yes, this gesture, and yes, all of that is very theatrical, right? And it works in the repertoire that she does, right? And she, you know, she never really, yeah, like she's like the same age as, you know, Gwen Stefani and you know, a lot of other kind of rock singers, right? And she's never attempted that kind of repertoire. And I think she would probably crash and burn if she tried that. It's because she's always done this very sort of Vegas showbiz style that, yeah, that was a smart path for her, that she has been able to transition smoothly. Yeah. Yes?
Do you find any trends regarding the mortality of child prodigies?
Well, it would be hard to say, because probably if they die young, we wouldn't know so much about them. But let me think. Yeah, no, that's worth investigating. Is child mortality lower amongst prodigies? I think certainly Carolyn Steedman's work about children on the stage in the 19th century, and she's mostly looking at child acrobats who performed in the streets and distinguishing them from children on the stage. The ones who actually got into stage work, theater work, pantomime work, that kind of thing, they tended to be better fed. Better clothed, better cared for. So they were, you know, they were actually healthier and happier lives. So most of them probably did grow up, whereas the kids on the street, I would assume, did not. But that is worth investigating. I will investigate that. Yeah. Carolyn.
So I don't think we've ever spoken to each other about this. Why do you think it is that Kuntulo Clark was able to grow up? Just out of curiosity, I know that she broke a lot of rules in show business in the sense that she was able to grow up.
Yeah.
She had hits in England after the age of 30, and she was a mom.
But she retreated. I think she went away for a while, right? She went to live in France. She disappeared from the scene, and then she had to come back, like Jackie Coogan, right? So
it's easier then for a child star to go away and then come back.
Yeah, I think I mean, certainly with Michael Jackson, right? That's something that with Susan's help I investigated closely, right? Like, how did that happen for him as he's getting to that point where his voice is going to change, he's entering adolescence, you know, the sort of cute little street swagger that he has as a little boy, right? If he's going to start doing that at age 20, 21, it's going to read very differently, right? It's a different kind of performance. It's going to be understood very differently. And so there has to be a lot of care in making that transition. And sort of all eyes are on him, all ears are on him at that time. He was extraordinarily lucky because, he's a phenomenal talent, obviously. But in most cases, that transition from what... I can't think now who the writer is who makes a distinction between small c creativity and big C creativity, right? Like the kind of creativity that actually changes your domain, that actually sort of changes what the expectations and standards are in your field. Not many children can make that transition. Mozart did it, Michael Jackson did it, Stevie Wonder did it. I'm not sure who else really I can think of. And I think Petula Clark, she went away and then she came back, and that was to her advantage.
It's interesting that all that success stories you just pointed to there were men.
Yeah, certainly.
So, is there a little girl?
Well, Clara Schumann.
Yes. Anyone more recent?
Yeah, I don't know. Celine, yeah. But I don't know that Celine actually, she's been extraordinarily successful, but yeah, maybe she has. Maybe she has actually changed the terms of what it is to be that kind of a singer. Yeah, I think she has actually. Okay, I take it back, Celine. Big C, creativity, yeah. Yeah. Thank you all for your attention.